All right, we are live. There's the doc. Sorry for any timing confusion.
Are we still enough of us? Like, it seems not a good, it seems a less crowded time than the other calls.
I agree. I don't know how much progress we're going to be able to make on the agenda items. I think if folks think that, we should just, cancel this week and try again in 2 weeks, I'm happy to do that.
We can go a quick run through maybe, but that's...
Yeah, I think it's probably, there's a few things I think that there's at least one thing I can talk about and just, give people heads up about. Okay, so going through this, the deep dive topics, again, it's like if people have specifics for topics that they want to discuss in a deep dive thing, please add them there. I know we've got one for the async context stuff, talk a little bit about that. It's not scheduled, but I think some of the stuff around it is coming together. And so talk about that when we get to it in the agenda. The CPU profiling roadmap. Peter, I don't know if you want to do an update there. Peter's on, right? Yes.
Yes, I'm here. Basically, the pull request in V8 was merged on last week. So the fix will be shipped with 6.7, so with the next V8 release. So the next step would be Mateus is working on the code event listener API. And after that, we can cover with some tests and CI jobs.
Okay, so you said it's going to be available in 6.7 release of V8?
Yes, exactly. So probably in the first release of Node.js V10.
I haven't looked at the fix. Is this something worth backporting?
That's a very good question. Maybe, but we haven't had any discussion about backporting yet.
Okay, let me take a look at the fix itself. And then, so right now, the stable V8 is 6.6. And I think the first, I'm not sure whether the first version, like 10.0.0, whether it's going to go out with 6.6 or 6.7. My guess is 6.6. So the two questions I have is whether we can backport this to 6.6, and the second one is whether we can backport it further back to older versions of Node.
Okay.
And I'll take a look at the fix to figure this out or ask the right people.
Okay, I think if you just make that comment on the issue, what we have in the diagnostic group, then Mateus will be able to reply.
Okay, we'll do that.
Thanks.
And then you said Mateus was looking at what?
On the Diagnostic Summit, we agreed that with the new code event listener API, we can have a much higher level interface, which is not Linux specific.
Okay.
That's the interface what we would like to cover with test and have a longer term support. So he started to working on that code event listener story.
Okay, great. Okay, anything else here? Nope.
Nope, I think we are good.
Okay, Diagnostics Channel, next steps. I don't have anything here. It looks like Stephen had his sort of proof of concept with this sort of a message bus, and he posted a link to that on here. I haven't seen anything else. It sounds like no update. I don't think Stephen's on. No. Okay. Nobody has anything to add with that one? Okay. Oops, I was looking at the wrong thing. Sorry, I was looking at the wrong document as I was going through these. So the order's a little messed up. So which one? The visualizing async context number 179. I don't know if Kelvin's on. This one's on the agenda.
Okay, Kelvin, yeah, he couldn't make it today. I think he got delayed somewhere. So I think we need him for that one.
He had opened it. I think, there's sort of this open question about, hey, what's the best way to sort of visualize these async contexts? I think that's something that's generally interesting. I know there's been a few efforts around it.
I can show some updates, latest prototype of our stuff, but it's still not. We're still really not ready on public consumption.
Yeah. Do you want to? Maybe we should just burn through the rest of the agenda, and then you can.
Yeah. I can show what we have done, so far, and so on. So it's
okay. Yeah. Let's get through the rest of the stuff here, and then you can share screen. That'd be awesome.
Yeah. Well, it's very little at this point. It's not really ready yet. So
okay.
It's an update. It's not anything. We need to still sort out some UI bugs.
Okay. So async hooks tracking issue. I know that somebody from New Relic chimed in on this, saying that they were seeing things fairly stable. I think that the last question here was the impact of promise hooks. And I think Yang had some action to investigate that at some level and do some kind of write-up. I don't think any progress was made there. I don't know if anyone else has any updates. Ali? Anyone else?
Yeah, no, what you summarized is correct. So the next action was for Yang to summarize, write a doc with a proposal on what might be changing with promise hooks. So the main thing blocking async hooks at this point is the question about performance and whether or not we need some changes in the API in order to be able to address performance. That's why it's going out a bit. So, and we haven't seen that talk from Yang just yet, and hopefully we can bring him, get him to talk about that. The other question is, recently at the TSC meeting, Bradley brought up the topic of zones, that zones should be pursued again at the TSC, and whether or not. So previously TSC it was claimed that Node was blocking it, although there's no official record of that. And I think James and Matteo wrote up a zones proposal. So maybe Matteo, you can talk about that.
I can talk very briefly. Like, we have thought a little bit on what could a zone thing for Node look like. Those brought more questions than answers, I would have to say, especially related to how zones are supposed to work and the main difference between those and an async context tracking mechanism such as async hooks, especially in terms of performance. So it's that's more or less is the major point of discussion.
Okay.
It's especially on so the core of the discussion is in the original zone proposal versus what we have was that it's a mechanism that you turn on versus something that is always on. So this is the major difference between, and one of the reasoning why to do that was mainly because it's you don't have to pay the performance penalty all the time. And one of the argument was that there was no performance penalty with zones, which I am very, very skeptical on that.
So actually we can, so zones are implemented by default on Dart. So we can maybe talk to those, the VM people from Dart side to see whether they agree with that statement. And I think the proposal that Mishko and Dominic had was pretty much copied from what Dart said.
My main concern is not on the JavaScript side, but on the fact that on our side, I don't see how we could implement them not on top of Async Hooks.
Yeah, I think we'll have to implement them on top of Async Hooks.
So it's Async Hooks. We measure this as an impact of maybe some 8% or something like that on top of our platform. Something like it. I am not comfortable in taking that hit all the time.
How did you measure that 8%?
We have some HTTP benchmarks. It's more or less what is coming out, but we have the raw data is being finalized. So we have done a lot of work between this and monkey patching to actually check what's the status of things. It has been delayed for some internal stuff at Nearform. So once it should be on its way out of, it has been unclogged, let me say, into the company pipes from the company pipes. So it should be on its way to be like, we have the data, we don't have the text about it.
Okay. So let me ask this: what's the motivation for wanting to sort of resurrect the zone stuff? Is it just from like a consumer API point of view, Zones provides a nice abstraction for people to deal with, or is there something else there?
Ali, probably you have a better. So one of the things that is missing, and we have talked about this a lot, it's and I've seen this in the wild so many times. We need in Node, but I think in JavaScript, a concept of asynchronous context.
I agree with that.
So, which is not what Async Hooks is, a lower level mechanism for that. Okay?
I agree with that.
And I strongly believe that we need one. Okay. That being zones is completely, or whatever we want to call it, is completely up in the air. Okay. Like I'm not. So my only my interest in this is because I've seen too many times that concept badly implemented, badly supported, and generally badly used in the ecosystem to convince me that the platform needs to provide it.
So can I? This is Mark, by the way. I'm hijacking Mike's mic. Do we have? Has anybody ever articulated what properties this ACE zones continuations something should support? Like, I've seen several proposals, but it's not clear. Like, what are the fundamental properties that this system?
Let me share what. So basically, James and myself wrote a deck, basically doing the bare minimum for tracking asynchronous context, leaving out the contextual pieces like error handling, for example.
Yeah, if you share that, that would be awesome.
I'll put the link here. It's not that it's anything. It's secret. It's.
You say a doc or a deck? It's
a deck.
Okay.
I need to get to it. Sorry, I have. Hangouts is a performance problem in itself.
So in the meanwhile, the interest I have in zones is talking to Benedict, at least, or talking to the VM people. They think they can implement it much more efficiently than they can implement promise hooks.
They
need to know the reason, but that's what they claim.
It's to me, it doesn't, like, to me, the core of the problem of this, just sorry, I can't talk. I need to focus on finding the stuff because
that's fine. Okay. Is there an issue open or something, or did this just come up in conversation in the TSC?
This came up on conversation on the TSC.
Okay. And did it come up as sort of a thing of like, this is what Node would like to do, or like, hey, we should go back to because I thought the zone stuff was an ECMAScript proposal.
Yeah, but if Node doesn't, it's believed that if Node doesn't implement it, it won't get through.
Okay. So, yeah, I mean, my take on that was, so my take on that was that there were some, concerns with the error handling APIs and the error handling semantics that were proposed with the zones proposal, and that the conversation just kind of got into a quagmire and people were talking past each other, right? And it just got to like this really deep level of like, oh, what about when I have this code that does this, and then this that does that, and then this that does this, and then this that does that, and then boom, and then this thing isn't right, and it just, like, me trying to read it made my head spin. Maybe I'm not the smartest guy and other people understand it, but that's fine.
No, I wasn't able to keep track of the discussion either. I think you're not alone.
Most of the people, a lot of the people on the Node side has changed.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think that from, so here's my take, and I think this might dovetail into some of the next the next agenda items when we get there, is that what we need sort of clear semantics about async execution flow, and then you can throw an API on top of that, right? And that API could look very much like zones, but it would leverage the same sort of set of concepts that sort of we're talking about, that we've been trying to sort of, clarify as with this issue 107, and then some of this async context modeling that Mark and I have been talking about. So
I tend to agree. I tend to agree that two things can more or less. This is very important though. Like, I think it's providing this information as a top level, the semantics and the API as a top level API in Node at least, but if JavaScript as well, it's something that is hard to create the consensus needed to do this.
Yeah, I agree, and I almost feel like if you can get to a like a set of clear, well understood concepts, right? Then what you can start doing is you can start layering on top of those well understood concepts on different implementations of APIs for things like asynchronous error handling, or context continuation storage, or things like that Zones is actually proposing to solve, right? And then I think what you could then do is you can have with the right set of concepts and terminology and shared understanding of that stuff, you can then have productive conversations about, well, what does async error propagation mean, or async exception handling, right? Like, what is that, right?
The asynchronous, the error handling is very tricky on the Node case. Okay, it gets very tricky. I understand that it's tricky. What I'm hoping we can do is we can sort of simplify that problem and abstract some of that away. Maybe we can. Let me see, guys. Let me see if you can open this link, because the page in Google presentation is not really loading for me, but you might be.
I got it.
Yeah, let me see if it gets opened, because because I can't at the moment, but it might be my computer. So.
Yeah, I can see it. I'll take a look at this. There's not an issue, you said, tracking this? And
no, there's not an issue. It's more or less our discussion there was related to to some key points. First of all, there is no root zone.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that it's not always enabled. You create one and you create a bunch of contexts that you want to track. Yep. But if you don't want that, you fold it and it's nothing. You have no overhead, more or less.
Okay.
And that's the first. That's one of the first thing, and the second thing, the missing error handling.
Okay.
Also, it helps not having a root zone. Helps a lot on some side edge cases on module loadings. so that you can't, given that there is no root zone, you need to create it from a user interaction. Then there is some edge cases where, you know, what you do, does each module gets its own zone? What's, you know, that gets very, very weird very soon.
Okay. Okay, I'll look through this. It'd certainly be nice to, you know, track this either in
somewhere. Oh, I'm happy. Again, James and I did this over an hour on the phone, just to reasoning loud. Okay, after that call. So
okay,
it has a couple. This is way much restricted. More or less, this goes at the. If you go to slide 18, this is probably the only thing that's needed from a node point of, from a platform point of view.
Okay. Okay. Okay, so this is a good dovetail, I think, into the next.
Before we move to the next topic, actually, I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into a comment that Matteo made, which was that async hooks has a fairly high overhead, and whatever we do, the zones will be implemented on top of async hooks. So one of the feelings I have is that async hooks listens to way too many events, and I think that's part of the problem. So if we could ensure that the events are triggered at the API level, so we don't need to emit events for all the lower levels of the API. All we're doing there is propagating context forward. But in certain cases, it's not necessary for us to have context if we can resurrect it at a higher level.
Well, it's almost like the way I think about it is like there's one point in time when you call from a user's point of view, right?
Right.
Like you call set timeout, right? And you pass a function into set timeout, right? And that's the point that we actually care about, saying like, hey, we've got something interesting that we need to use for, you know, to track this asynchronous context. It is, we took a function, we passed it across a boundary such that that function is going to be invoked later in some other new context, new async context, right? And those are the interesting things, right? And all of the other stuff ends up being very noisy from the point of view of somebody who just wants to understand the async context, right? Is that a fair paraphrase of what you said, Ali?
Yes, but noisy is not the only problem. The other problem is that it has performance overhead.
Sure.
All these JavaScript before and after functions need to execute, which we probably don't want.
Yes. Yes, noisy and costly. And so I think, you know, some of the stuff that we've been talking about with trying to get you know, some more clear definitions around async context sort of addresses some of this stuff, right? And it introduces some concepts that I think we can reason about. And I think it would, you know, you could, I haven't looked at how to do this in Node. And I don't know all of the places where we'd have to go in and tweak code in Node. But
well, I think you go and look at what the public documentation for the API is, and if it says this is an async, you know, function, then that's where you want to add this tweaking, and that defines your client boundary.
Let me say a couple of things. That's not necessarily true. There are modules that dig deep, plenty. We have been fighting those for ages. Ali knows as well as myself and everybody else.
You mean like native modules that are trying to do async callbacks and things like that?
Well, those are actually, this is actually part of the supported API. That's actually fine. Mm-hmm. They will need to be instrumented as well, but that's their job. The major problem is modules that use internal functions and internal stuff. That's why Async Hooks are implemented the way they are, because we can't really trust our users.
So what do you mean by that?
I can make you an example. Go look at how the gracefulFS module was implemented on version 3 and cry. Sorry, like your model will not work. They were doing process binding and getting the native binding and completely writing a new shim on top.
Yeah. No, I was sort of at a very high conceptual level. Like my intern used that approach, and you're absolutely right. You have to go in and do it for the internal APIs too. But conceptually, like if I'm a good user, when I call across that boundary from my code into the Node core code, and okay, so for the bad users, that boundary might be things that were internal, and those need to be caught as well. But that first transition is what you care about.
Yeah, well, yes, this is true. However, if you lose the context, in case of an error, that gets tricky.
In the case of an error, you mean that somebody just, I guess I don't follow that.
Oh, if something goes kaboom, fails, you will need to get that reference at that point of that context will need to be surfaced somehow. It goes into error handling. Like it is the problem of context tracking. It's tied somehow into error handling. So it's very hard not to do that without not talking about error handling. So as Dominic De Nicola said plenty in a very long issue and discussion, where the full zone thing stopped. So
you're saying though that if I call into some function foo and I pass a callback, that in the execution of foo an error occurs.
Yep.
That's tricky.
Well, if it's an internal thing, so if you have some JavaScript that is only run internally. So let me say I have two streams. Okay. Now the user, I pipe two streams together.
Okay.
So I have data coming from C going to a stream in JavaScript, then going back into C. This is how the piping thing works, by the way. I don't know if you're familiar with all this stuff. So it goes up and down.
Sure.
And you do this. Now, as a user, I might be only interested when that stuff ends. Okay. Typically, I want to track if my streams pipeline ends. So in theory, I will only need to have the context on my latest callback.
Okay.
Okay. However, those various entities can emit an error event at any point in time.
Okay.
So it means that you need to, in all cases, you need to reconstruct, to recreate the context, to have the context.
When you raise the error event.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or when anybody of those individual thing finishes and so on. There is a lot that I don't think the error even
I guess if the context is associated
with the handler.
Yeah, with the callback, the function that you're invoking on error, or the function that you're invoking on data, or whatever those things are. You've got an event, you've got a function. That function has a necessary bit to set up the context.
Yes, it is the problem. If you bind it to closure scope, so either you put it in closure scope, either you don't put into closure scope.
Okay.
If you put into closure scope, it won't work.
Yeah.
Okay. Why?
Because the event emitter model allows you to use top level functions.
Okay. I mean, it's the same thing as with promises, where there's a link and there's a cause, and they don't always line up, and they don't line up with lexical scope naturally.
Okay.
I mean, this is.
So
okay.
That's the tricky part. So it's very.
I mean, I think one of the challenges is there's a sort of a general default semantics, which you'd like to have people happen automagically. But there are weird things like people plumbing into the internals, not perfect alignment between, lexical scoping in the code and the dynamic scoping that you want and where things are linked and where they're caused and user space queuing that mean you need to have sort of a nice default behavior plus a clean way to override that explicitly if that's what the user intended in their semantics, right? Or at least a graceful degradation if it doesn't line up right.
More or less.
Okay.
As I say, I don't pretend to. We don't have any answers. Okay, this is very much. I don't want to hijack the meeting discussing this. Sorry.
No, it's interesting to discuss it. I just think so. I think the summary though is that zones has resurfaced in discussion primarily because of concerns around performance impact of async hooks and the thinking that zones can be implemented more better at the VM level. Is that a fair statement?
I would not do that. I would not say. I would say that the discussion has been resurfaced because of all of what you said, plus the fact that I myself, James, probably Ali, and I don't know who else believe that there is a need for uniform way to track the asynchronous context across JavaScript applications.
Okay. Yeah, I agree.
Which it's kind of a statement, agreeing that we are saying that loud and agreeing that this is a need, then we can discuss what that might look like. Okay. Yep. And everybody has a different view, but saying that I think it's the first step to get something in motion that we can solve this problem in some time. This is a hard problem. It will require some time and some iterations.
I agree. Okay. Anything else on this stuff? So one question I have is for async hooks. I mean, is it going to? I think the question was, is it going to get out of experimental for Node 10? I haven't heard anything explicit, but my take on the discussion we're having now is that the answer is no. Is that fair?
Sorry, can you rephrase?
What I thought the goal was to have async hooks be out of experimental for Node 10.
For Node 10 LTS, yes, I would say.
So but it sounds like we're far away from that.
I am not necessarily, because given that the data that I have seen compared to a monkey patching approach for APM, I would say we need to get the output data, but I would say the approach with async hooks completely outperforms in all possible cases, even with promises.
It outperforms?
Yeah, it's way better in any case than monkey patching.
So you're saying async hooks performs better than monkey patching?
Yes.
Okay.
So
I haven't observed that. I have not observed that.
I think we have it's either equal or better.
Okay, because that goes against what Ali was just saying about the high overhead with async hooks.
Well, I'm not saying it has no overhead. I'm just saying it's not worse than the previous solution.
That would surprise me. I would love to see some what the measurement.
Oh yeah, exactly. Like this is we will share with you the preliminary data out of this, but this is what we have measured in using real life implementation. Okay, not dummy code. So using real life implementation, we check that. And if Ali, you have some stuff that we haven't considered, probably we should include that. But anyway, this seems the case. It seems that you can get slightly. You have seen that the overhead of async hooks was higher than monkey patching.
No, and I haven't seen that, and intuitively, it doesn't make sense to me because monkey patching is propagating context at higher levels of the API, and async hooks are doing a lot more events for even the lower level events. So it just
I would also say visible to the JavaScript optimizer.
Right.
Yeah, it's that. Yes and no. So even though it's visible, all the monkey patching that's doing probably that is destroy whatever optimization V8 can do. So that's, to me, that's kind of the reason.
Not necessarily.
I don't know. I am like some of the code that I've seen for that does this monkey patching. I would, at least on the oldest, there was no chance this was running decent on previous nodes. And I haven't seen. I don't know. This is my take on. That was my explanation.
Yeah, on real world applications with monkey patching, we see around let's say 5% or so overhead from monkey patching.
With Async Hooks, have you tried a similar approach?
We don't have the numbers for async hooks.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, we have done some measurements. So I'll share with all of you before publishing, so at least the approach can be validated to some extent. But that was we have some of the things that we have seen where with monkey patching were actually like 30% even.
But that's the same is true for async hooks in some cases, right? So
yeah. No, it's on the same case. It was like exactly, but it's not. It doesn't seem to me a worse technology. So blocking on performance probably is not needed. That was my take on this. So that's at least my take. I would select other conditions for it to be moved out of experimental. If it can improve, it will improve, absolutely. But that's a second level. Yeah. I wouldn't hold it to.
So is this something then that's getting discussed at TSC?
No, I haven't. I'm just flagging. I'm talking about this data now. This data is not.
No, I mean just async hooks and it's experimental.
No, it's part of. It needs async hooks needs some conditions to exit.
Okay.
Experimental status. So I think those should be written down somehow.
Yeah. So my suggestion would be the diagnostic working group should recommend to the TSC what should be done. And at this point, I don't think this working group has consensus on whether it should move out of experimental. And I guess the first step, as Matteo said, in doing that would be to verbalize what are the precise requirements. And then maybe we can have a discussion about whether it's ready to move out of experimental.
Okay. And is there anything in this issue now that says that what is necessary? I thought there was a number of items, like checkbox items. There's nothing that says like to get out of experimental, we need to do the following. So it sounds like that's the list that we want. There are some things in particular that haven't been done in terms of understanding perf impact, understanding our tolerance level of that. There's a specific thing about this trigger async ID change and whether it's Semper major or minor. There's questions about the logical model, which potentially has some overlap with the zones thing.
And I think that would be concerning if we felt like there were big incontinuities or whatever, discontinuities between the semantics that async hooks and what we want at a higher level if they aren't bridgeable.
I agree.
Okay, so there's work there. Does anybody want to take an action to actually start that list in this issue 124?
sure. Yeah.
Okay. You sound sort of reluctant to.
No, I can do that.
Okay. It was almost like a affirmative question. Sure.
Yeah. Just I'm basically writing off all my time. So that was, yeah.
No, I know the feeling. Which is why I asked if there's anybody that wants to do it. Okay. Okay, okay. So that's good. I think we at least have some action and clarity about that. And I think that was the question that somebody was asking on this the other day, is it going to get out of experimental?
Also, some of the vendors, from my understanding, are waiting to, APM vendors are waiting to move to this to improve their situation.
Waiting why?
To adopt us, because it's experimental, it can change anytime and they don't want to take the hit. However, this is causing them problems for native promises, async await, and stuff like that. So
yeah.
So I think people have no choice. I think this is the only thing, even if it's experimental, this is the only thing you can use at this point.
So
or the promise in async await.
Yeah, which is everywhere now.
To me, it seems. To me, this alone seems it's a condition to exit experimental to some extent.
Okay.
Like it's a basic condition. Like this fact alone, this functionality is needed by the platform to run. So we should at least flag it as stable, and if we want to change it, it's a some major change.
Yeah, I'm not so sure about that. I think if the platform needs it, the same argument can be made that the language needs it, and the language isn't solving this problem.
Bingo.
Yeah, on that I agree on that. So
yeah, I think, and to be honest, it's like my take is this is something that spans Node. I mean, it's applicable to the browser as well. My gut is that there's language constructs here and VM implementation stuff to make this a really clear, consistent, understandable story. And I'm not ready to go there yet, but that's what my gut's telling me. So. Okay, anything else on 124? Okay, so so then this async context formalization and diagnostic support. There's there's a separate GitHub repo where we tried to take some of the stuff that Mark was working on in that academic paper, and then trying to distill it down. You know, it is effectively trying to say, here's a conceptual model to think about asynchronous context, and we've got PR up there for some changes in terminology that I think make this a little bit more accessible. I tried to CC the Node.js Diagnostics, but that didn't work for some reason, because it's in a separate repo. So I'll just paste a link here. If anybody wants to go and chime in on this set of terminology, that would, I think, be really useful. What basically we're defining now is you know, a few different terms. I think one is a continuation, where a continuation is a function that gets passed into as a parameter into some other function, and it's going to be invoked later in some separate asynchronous context, right? Continuation point is a function that takes a continuation as a parameter. So the example there, I think, is, you know, set timeout would be a continuation point, and you would pass it a continuation. And then, you know, the linking point or link context is whenever that continuation is constructed or passed into this continuation point. We previously talked about linking context and causal context. There was some confusion, I think, as we talked to people about the term cause and causal context. So we changed that to sort of the ready context or a ready point with similar semantics to what we had defined before. And so I think with this set of terminology, and I really would appreciate feedback around it, that this story or the set of concepts that we're trying to communicate are a little stronger, and it's a little easier to talk about these things. And so, you know, I think the rest of the stuff that we've been talking about, that is at these different points in time, there's events. These events can be, you know, constructed into a DAG. This DAG can be traversed, sort of get you all of the functionality that you would need to build on top of this, a zones API or continuation local storage API or async error handling or long stacks or whatever it is that you wanted to do. But I think this starts to get us to sort of a formalized set of terms and semantics. And then to Ali's last point, I kind of feel like this notion of this continuation sort of lends itself to sort of some language support. And you know, when we're ready to fight that battle. Yeah.
Side note, it's I think it's a great work, great idea. So also we have the possibility in Node.js to release stuff in the wild as experimental, which the web platform does not. So we can, in fact, iterate over this concept for a long time before even rising it to a spec.
Yeah. There's yeah, we were thinking of a similar thing. I think like what we'd probably try and do, we've been talking about this internally here. What we were going to try and do was sort of write a native layer that exposes these concepts that a host could plug into, or a host could use when they're hosting a JavaScript engine. And then they would have this set of events, and they would have the DAG produced for them. And it would, you know, the goal is that it would be low cost, efficient, and wouldn't, you know, cause, you know, like, you know, allocation management problems or things like that. Hopefully we'll have, so we have a sketch of what that native API looks like, and then we're hopefully going to have something built on top of Chakra for that, and we might try and make it work with V8. I think it might be possible that somebody could just take that library and make it work with V8. So then it's a question then is like, once you have a native library that kind of supports this model that we've been talking about, where inside of the host do you need to start plugging stuff in to kind of leverage this thing? Now we've got some small scale examples here that I think are a little easier than Node probably to kind of wire all that up. We're probably going to be playing with that hopefully in the coming months, month singular, months plural maybe. And it should inform some of the thinking around this. Yeah. But I do want to say though that I think the browser space has this as a, you know, I think it's just as much of a problem, and it's just as applicable to the browser space. So we're sort of looking at this from both Node and the browser.
Fantastic.
So actually, I have to drop off now. I have another meeting to go to.
Sure. Thanks, Ali.
Ali, bye.
Bye.
All right. I think that was it.
I mean, I know Matteo.
It's if you want to see something, I can briefly show Otherwise, I can leave it for next time. I will have something more meaningful next time, Italy.
It's up to you. What would you prefer?
I will just say next time. I need to drop as well. So that's yeah. It's not done. Otherwise, I will just say yeah. I will be with much more fanfare that we have something on NPM. When we have something on NPM, it will be. I will have way more fanfare. We are kind of close, but we had whatever.
Okay.
Anyway, talk later. Bye-bye.
Bye, Matteo. Ted, hope you found this useful, and we'll see you again next 2 weeks.
I did. Yeah, so just so you know, yeah, I'm coming here from Open Tracing and the W3C distributed tracing group. And we're just going to try to start dovetailing with you all more actively, just to catch up with where you all are at and make sure we can kind of align our efforts, since we're working with all the APM vendors who care about all this stuff.
Yeah,
so this was, yeah.
So yeah, so that's great. I think there's one specific effort, which is there's a bunch of APM vendors that need to go in and monkey patch a bunch of things, and there was a goal to try and get on some shared implementation of monkey patching with some pub sub model that libraries can kick up events that have interesting data, and then subscribers can listen to that. There's been some talk, I know internally here at Microsoft, there's been some talk about open census.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the goal was to sort of have this library, the monkey patching thing be there. And then on top of it, if somebody wanted to layer on top of that some open census integration stuff, they could do that. I assume likewise, open tracing, somebody could do that as well. That effort to sort of solidify that, it's like people have talked about it, and it hasn't seen a whole lot of traction, but it comes up in the context of these working group things. We pulse on the status of it. So if you want, I think the specific issue there right now is let me find it.
In the meantime, I shared the link. I have some experience with Open Tracing and Node.js. We are not using Open Tracing at Netflix, but let me know if you have a question.
Oh, this is very interesting. Yeah, I will definitely take a look at this.
I made this repository half a year ago, so it's probably not up to date, but then it was working.
Well, we're sort of just turning our attention back around to JavaScript now, which is why we're interested in kind of getting up to speed, both like what are node-specific efforts that are going on and what are JavaScript-based efforts that are going on that'd be applicable in the browser. Because you shared something else? Tracer?
Yes, and I have a third link. I'm going to share that as well.
Ooh la la! So this is deriving metrics information based on trace points?
Yes, and the third one is capable to visualize the whole infrastructure from Open Tracing.
Oh, so cool. I love this stuff.
So I think the specific issue here is this issue 180, which is what I was talking about, where there's a shared monkey patch thing, and then on top of those APIs, you could layer in something that's going to do open tracing specific stuff, or open census, or whatever things somebody else wants to come up with. And I think the key thing is to make sure that these applications, like sort of Peter posted, or any of what these APM vendors need, or what you would need to produce valid open tracing messages, would work with whatever the monkey patching pub sub model is producing, right?
Yeah.
And that's missing a driver right now. This issue 180 is just kind of lagging a little bit. So it's like, feel free to kind of step in there. I can provide some context. I don't have cycles to
Sure.
sort of drive it at the moment.
I would love a bit of context if you have a second.
Sure.
I'm curious, when you say monkey patching, what do you mean there?
Sorry. So in
the
Java,
meantime, I'm leaving. Thank you, guys.
Okay, Peter. Thanks a lot.
Peter, I'll check out those links.
Yeah, sure. Let me know if you need help. Bye.
Yeah.
So in JavaScript, you can overwrite functions, right? And so when you have an object, say you've got like a MongoDB driver, and you want an event when you issue a find query, right?
Yeah.
You can take the find, you can go into the driver object and you can replace the find method with your own implementation that will emit some data somewhere, right? And then call the original implementation.
Okay, so this is a sort of dynamic instrumentation approach.
Exactly, and it is it's generally it's highly useful, but it's generally considered brittle, right? Because you're necessarily taking dependencies on the implementation. Sometimes you need to dig into the internals of some of these libraries. And so the general goal is to get away from that. And the other piece here is that all the different APM vendors need to go off and do this, right? And so they end up redoing, they're all doing the same thing. And so the end result is that ideally we'd be in a position where there was a shared single source of monkey patching that would produce some data and raise that data on a message bus. And then the consumers of this, either the APM vendors or something like Open Tracing, could listen to that, what's coming off of that message bus, and then consume those messages, transform them into something useful for whatever their purpose is, and do whatever it is they want to do with those, right? So that's kind of the thinking here. I think when we had discussed this previously, the question of open tracing came up, the question of open census came up. I think it was decided that whatever was done in this monkey patching library would be agnostic to sort of the details of whether open tracing was chosen or open census or anything else. But we would just get in there and monkey patch stuff, publish messages in whatever format, and then push changes back on the various libraries that were being monkey patched, such that we don't have to go in and dynamically instrument them, but the libraries would be natively instrumented, right? Is kind of the approach.
Cool. So I think that's not, I totally get that approach. I don't think that's not an approach that's too interesting to me in open tracing for our purposes. With that dynamic, the way I look at this stuff is the dynamic stuff is interesting. And by the way, if you have to go,
no, I'm good for about 10 more minutes here. So
okay, great. That the dynamic, I mean, it's interesting, but what we're kind of focused on is more when you, if you're trying to trace your code, right? You're trying to, it's all about context propagation. Mm-hmm. So the core problem is propagating context first on these RPC hops,
sure.
And then propagating context down through the program to the next RPC hop. And so the fundamental question there is, in Node, is like, how does that context propagation work? Not so much dynamic monkey patching, but real context propagation. So it sounds like that's coming along. That was this. We were just talking about it, and you guys call. Let me look at my notes. What you guys were calling that?
Oh, the async
Close my
hooks,
notes.
async context.
Yeah, async context.
Yeah, so
right?
that's not so much with an RPC call as it is internally inside of Node. So the problem there is that in JavaScript programs, it's JavaScript single-threaded, right? So there's a lot of these callback passing styles, right? That is, you say like, hey, I want to read some data from a file, and when that data is read, have the runtime call this function, and that stuff gets queued up and then it gets invoked synchronously, right?
Yeah.
Now the problem is when you have a series of these things that are chained together, you want to know sort of the path of execution.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
And that's the fundamental problem with this asynchronous context. It doesn't cross process boundaries though.
But so that does not cross process boundaries. But what happens is a message comes in through an RPC call, right? Tracing, let's just to be clear, for me, tracing is just logs with request level indices.
Sure.
Essentially, right? That's like basically it. And so when you're logging, you just have to have the right indices getting stamped onto that log. Yada, yada. Everything else is really like whatever. But that's the core thing. And so when something comes through an RPC call, you need to be able to extract whatever those indices are from metadata on the RPC call.
Sure.
And then you're logging. But then as you log and go through the program, you have to have a way of propagating within the program those identifiers.
Yes.
So that all the logs you're doing come off of that. And that to me is where something like async context would come in. It looks like the API for that.
Yeah, well, it would be necessary. I mean, async context would enable something like continuation local storage, which would enable you to, when you receive an inbound HTTP request, to pull some header data to say like, this is my request identifier, and then propagate that along a series of asynchronous invocations, such that when you then make an outbound RPC call, you can take that same identifier and stick it in your ID chain, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so they all kind of relate. Like you need the async context stuff so that you can propagate state across asynchronous boundaries inside the process. The question then becomes is, well, say you've got something inbound on an HTTP header and you need to send it outbound on some other RPC header. Like how do you do that in an open tracing way, or how would you do that in an open census way, right? And I think that's some of where we were talking about, well, what is the monkey patching stuff and how does that all plug in? So
but we don't think there should be monkey patching, or at least I don't think there should be monkey patching for this core part of actually propagating those identifiers and injecting and extracting them. We kind of think you should not, if you can monkey patch them, okay, but that you should just do that, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I could see where if it's HTTP that you could have some middleware that would sit in there and it would sort of, pull things off of the headers or something. And I could see where if, maybe if you've got some other RPC in the library that's doing some other protocol that maybe you have something slightly different. I guess what I'm not clear about is if somebody wanted to use this, how much code do they have to go and write to stitch together one of these applications that would just automatically propagate all of these things, right?
Right.
And is that the kind of thing that then becomes sort of an onerous task for the end user or not? I certainly think it would be interesting from the diagnostics, because I'm assuming this comes up a lot in like these microservice applications where people are wanting to trace requests from one service to another service to another service.
Exactly.
I assume it would be a really interesting exercise for the Node.js Diagnostics working group to kind of say like, hey, what does it mean for somebody to use open tracing inside a canonical Node app? What does that even look like, right?
Yeah.
And for somebody to start pulling the thread on that and being like, oh yeah, this part's easy, this part's hard, this breaks down here, I lost some state there, whatever those things are. If you wanted to do that, I totally encourage you to do it, and we can certainly pulse on it here in the working group meetings. We can open an issue in the Diagnostics, the Node.js Diagnostics GitHub repository, and then you can start. You'll get people to chime in and pile in there. I don't know that you'll get people to do work. You'll get people to share opinions. But that's the I don't know. You'll get one piece of work for every 20 opinions or whatever. That's the way it is.
That's fine. Yeah. I think for me, the core thing is getting people kind of on the same page about what it is people are trying to do, why people are propagating these indices, and like what's annoying about that versus what makes it easy. And all open tracing really is saying, like, when you write this library code, like you're going to write libraries, you're going to share them. We're all going to glue libraries and packages together. And the code that has to actually do to the degree to which there's work other than just writing your logging API, and if it's, open tracing or whatever, that's just a matter of saying, there's some magical place I know where to go grab these identifiers from, so you can just log away. And if these things are around, they'll just automatically get integrated because there's some context propagation mechanism that is explicit, and you can go grab stuff out of a bag there, right? So that's easy. The part that's hard is just whatever code is actually injecting and extracting this stuff from headers, and then instrumenting within those libraries. You just want an API that doesn't haul in any dependencies or makes any decisions that you want to make at the application level as opposed to the library level. Like, where am I going to admit this information to? What format is it going to come out in? That kind of thing.
So you're saying that has to happen at the app level instead of the library level?
There's certain things that if you want to put diagnostic information into your library, and then this library is going to run in lots of different environments. Yep. Then it's like you hit this wall where you're like, well, what logging framework should I pick?
Well, that's exactly what this that's exactly what this 180 issue is trying to figure out, right? So say you've got the Mongo, say you're using Mongo, right, in your app, and you download the MongoDB drivers, right? And one person is downloading the MongoDB drivers, and they're talking to a MongoDB service in AWS. And AWS has its own sort of correlation tracking thing that they use, and they expect it to work with Mongo in a certain way.
Right.
And another person wants to use that same library, but they want it to work with Azure, right?
Yep.
And so at that point, like, how do you have one single library that's actually going to both people can use, and then you can compose it with the right chunk of stuff that knows how to add correlation logic for the AWS protocols and knows how to add correlation, or the AWS service, and the other one knows how to add the right correlation IDs for the Azure requests, right?
Yep.
And so that's where we're trying to get to with this issue 180, which is that the MongoDB driver is going to kick up some events, right, and say like, hey, this is happening, and I know this is some state, and then observers have the opportunity to plug in and either mutate some of that state, add headers, or do whatever it is that they need to do, such that you don't have to sort of hack the things up to work correctly with AWS or work correctly with that, things like that.
Yeah.
So I think that
makes sense.
There's probably more overlap in this 180 with what it is you're trying to do and what you're thinking about than maybe you realize. But I think the open tracing stuff is probably it's probably a really interesting exercise to just come up with an app or something and just kind of start pulling the thread on it and pulse on it here. I'm happy to add stuff to the agenda. So
I'm happy to do that work. I think part of it is just where it comes down to ultimately, I think, is like efficiency in terms of like how much work is having to get recreated? Does every vendor or every tracing program have to then create dynamic hooks for every single version of every single library? And then the other issue is like the overhead of like a general purpose monkey patching solution versus someone just has an API for explicitly doing these like 3 steps, but that API doesn't haul. That API is such that it's like a 2-sided API. People can bind to that. It sort of relates to what Ali was saying. It's like, if you have a general purpose thing, then it's like it traces all the things, and then that's really expensive. And you're like, no, please just hook into the things I want. And you're like, well, which ones are those? And it's like, well, we don't know.
Well, yeah, and that's one of the things that we're trying to address with this 180 issue is that we expect there to be a pub sub model where you can basically say, if somebody's listening for my specific event, then publish some data on the channel. And then somebody can, on the other side, they can say like, hey, I want to listen for events of this type, right? And then so then the publisher knows if anybody's listening, the subscriber can sit there and say, I'm listening, and he'll get a callback. Right. He'll receive some object in that callback with some state, and based on the type that they're listening, the type of event that they're listening for, that will be a well-defined structure, and then they can go in there and either read stuff out of it or in some cases mutate things. I think that might be a little controversial, but I think it's going to be necessary based on some of the things we talked about. So that's sort of built on.
Yeah, sorry, is this built on top of async hooks, or is this just a...
No, I mean, so there's one current, so right now there's one thing that's in place, which is called Diagnostic Channel, which is a Microsoft project.
I saw that.
And that is sort of agnostic in terms of how asynchronous context propagation works. So you can plug in a different implementation of a library to ensure that, and as long as it's like you meet some API, which is like, what's my current context, store something for this execution context, and get you want a key value store across asynchronous invocations, right? And as long as you provide that semantic, then you can plug in whatever implementation you want. Async hooks is one implementation. It's currently in implementation inside of Node. It's implemented at a very low level. And then there's some, as you heard, people being discussed. There's, I think, some questions about the performance of that, of async hooks under different circumstances. So.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, this has been very useful to me. I'll bring this back to the clan, and they'll have a look. It'll probably be either me or we might have a rotating person show up to these calls. I think that's Red Hat people are interested.
Yeah, I think that's fine. It's feel free to like reach out if you have questions. It's like if you want to add things to the agenda or something, just I think I've got the permissions to do that. I don't know that everybody does, but or if you want issues open, what we generally do is we have an issue open in the Diagnostics, Node.js Diagnostics, and it gets tagged, and then it comes up here, and we talk about it. People can give status, and that's probably the best way.
Yeah.
Like, at first, you might get a lot of like, feels like nobody's interested, but then I think you'll start seeing some traction. And I think it would be good, like, I feel like the group, and, partially my fault, just I haven't been as involved over the last couple months. But, it's getting we could use a shot of momentum, so
sure.
come in and be like, hey, we were making traction on X, Y, or Z, then I think that would be a really positive thing. So I encourage you to come back, bring your colleagues.
I think we can do a mock-up. I think your suggestion is great of being like, hey, we got to like hook all this stuff up together. We kind of think this approach based on top of async context and, like native API, native package instrumentation is like the most efficient way to make everybody happy. And here's how that works. And then if you wanted to like monkey patch on top of that to decorate this thing, you can also do that. So I think we could make a presentation of that, and maybe that'll drive some interest.
Yeah, feel free to reach bi-weekly, so feel free to reach out if you have any questions about, like the best way to, either, get something on the agenda or broach it or whatever it is, and happy to answer questions. So
great, cool.
Thanks,
so
Ted.
much fun. Thanks for hosting.
Yeah, appreciate it.
All right, ciao.
Bye.